Okay, hi everybody. Um, in this recording, I'm going to try to go over some of the major types of Passerine flight calls that are useful to learn, especially if you're um, like a morning flight type of counter or um, just trying to expand your birding from stuff that's sitting in front of you to try to pick up as much as possible of what's flying by, little stuff. So, first of all, I'm very much a beginner on this stuff, even though I've been trying to work on it for a few years. Um, I don't quite go birding enough to quite cross the threshold of being good at this. Um, People who do hawk watching or do a season of um, morning flight and are out every day and really experience the full volume of migration. I get so much more practice. I've gotten more practice in my 5 or 6 or 7 days of doing morning flight at Cape May than I have in all my cumulative um, days out in Pennsylvania, just because most of my days out in Pennsylvania, I get these flight calls, just a couple times, a few little things real quick. Um, so I certainly am not an expert, but it doesn't take an expert to point you to some useful links. And that's the main strength of this presentation. If you don't know about these links, um, that's the main thing that I think you'll get out of it. Um, I'm going to spend a little bit of time. I don't know that I'll cover all this in today's recording, but I'm going to start with some lower pitch stuff like bobolink, meadowlark, um, the the low pitched stuff that has the most volume when you do nocturnal flight calls are thrushes, scarlet tanager, rose-breasted grosbeak, that kind of stuff. And um, those are not ones that you get a lot of in Pennsylvania in morning flight or Cape May either. Um, not there aren't some of these going by in morning flight, but they're not as dominant as the warblers. So I'll skip through that and skip the nuance of that later. I think putting together a whole presentation on a topic like Veery versus Scarlet Tanager or overlap between rose-breasted grosbeak candidate calls and various thrush candidate calls makes a lot of sense. So dealing with this complex can be mostly an issue for another day, but we can look at some of them. Um, Finches, I'm also not going to put a ton of time on, but we can look at a little bit today. Um, the horned lark, American pipit, and then the horned lark versus longspur for the down whistle call, and then the rattles of like um, the longspur family is worth a good look at. Those definitely have a nice volume of daytime flybys, and certainly my identification of these guys has increased a lot since um, I've learned to get better at their calls. Um, Sparrow calls, certainly chipping sparrows and Savannah sparrows do this when they're flying around. A lot of the bushy sparrows, you can get used to hearing the flight calls, and that'll help you when you're just looking at them in the bushes, no matter um, if they're really in morning flight or not. Um, I might need to do a separate recording in the interest of time to go through the warblers in the whole a whole presentation just to deal with them. And since there are some buzzy warblers, it makes sense to do the indigo bunting together with the buzzy warblers and then transition to the lower pitched ones. I'm certainly going to be skipping stuff that's rare up here in Pennsylvania. So, I'm not going to do painted bunting and other other tricky birds like that. I'm also not going to spend much time on some really important flight calls that are very important to know. But for me, I kind of knew most of these calls to some extent before I started really diving in on the nocturnal flight calls. These are ones that, like these first three, sure, you get them in nocturnal flight from time to time. I haven't gotten much in the way of blackbirds at night calling. I certainly have gotten a couple goldfinches at night, but that's pretty rare compared to how much they call during the day. Um, but all these are ones that I mostly learned from my diurnal birding and not gonna spend much time on here. So let's dive in on bobolink and meadowlark. One source that I use a lot for references on flight calls is the um, online sound repository for Nathan Peplow's Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds. When I bought it, it was of Eastern North America, but now it's expanded to the West as well. So I guess it's just North America as a whole here on the online. It has it all. The flight call that I hear a lot, I call it the bink call, but Nathan calls it zreet. This is definitely one you'll hear. Um, a bunch of them. You can hear some of the variation. And here's another, the classic ones. So that's one resource where you can find that, and we could get Eastern Meadowlark from there too. But just to point out that you can also get Eastern Meadowlark off the eBird page. They have the listen, and on listen they have the flight call. This goes a lot higher than the bobolink does. I call that the street call. And I have definitely gotten this bird a few times just flying way up high in the blue sky as it goes by. And I learned that call because I first recorded it over my house at night. So the thrushes, the best way to go over the thrushes is when this website is working. It seems like whenever this website gets a lot of attention, then the sounds are disabled temporarily. I think it's like a bandwidth for this web hosting service. So you might have to wait a few months until I think the bandwidth might reset once a month or whatever. But this site is sometimes up, sometimes down in terms of being able to listen. But it's a great resource. And when these bars aren't grayed out, then it means you can play them. The other thing I wanted to point you out about Paul Driver's website is look at finch flight calls, icterid flight calls, like all these topics that I'm covering are covered way better by him. He's got great great articles and descriptions and very thoughtful. Again, these calls during the day, I mostly hear them coming out of the trees and bushes, not so much in sustained flight here in central Pennsylvania. But I think these are call notes to learn, again, call notes that I learned from nocturnal flight calls. Just to give you a couple quick examples, here's another source that you can always check, which is Xeno-Canto. You can do an advanced search. You can put in the species and the call type as flight call. So, rose-breasted grosbeak, and then a killdeer, and then we'll hear the grosbeak again. Here. So that's one of the call types. I kind of think that rose-breasted grosbeak is pretty diverse in the sounds that it makes. Another awesome resource, really the classic, most excellent resource, is the website for Old Bird. This is the Bill Evans and Michael O'Brien repository of recordings. So if we wanted to, for example, check out Scarlet Tanager and Rose-breasted grosbeak, not only do they show the spectrograms, but also if you click on them, you can listen. So this is the more clear call, and this is more thick, burry, husky version of their call. And Scarlet Tanager seems to have a lot of complexity. That's a topic for another day, but also have Rose-breasted grosbeak here, and we'll get back to this page for buntings at another point. I'll save the Scarlet Tanager. That's back on Nathan's page. So finches, if you know American goldfinches, potato chip or patututu, that one, pine siskin, the clee, crossbills, chip chip chip. I think I'll go over finches in another recording, but redpolls are one that when they're around, I sort of learn it and then I kind of forget what they sound like. But it's sort of halfway back in my mind. But definitely a high fraction of all the siskins, crossbills, and redpolls that I've ever put on a checklist have been flyby, as it is for evening grosbeak. Whenever they're moving, there's a lot more to be picked up that way than there are by finding them in the trees or at your feeders. At least that's been my experience. Of course, some people's feeders are loaded, but most of the time they're not around here. Anyway, the evening grosbeak, just recently I had a gray-cheeked thrush in my neighborhood for a couple days, and it was calling from a stand of spruces that the previous winter I had heard an evening grosbeak in. So as soon as I heard that call, it's kind of funny how similar it is to some of the gray-cheeked thrush variations, to get those parts of my brain going. But it's funny the things that collide. You wouldn't expect to confuse a grosbeak with a thrush, but so it goes. So let's do horned lark and pipit first. We can do these here. So horned lark flight calls, stuff like this. And then compare that to American pipit. I normally think of the pipit flight calls as being a bit more standard. Seems like they have a little more rhythm to it. Getting a little more non-standard. I don't hear that regularly. Anyway, that's more of the normal stuff that I've heard. Actually, the wheat I'm not very familiar. This is more than most. But I feel like usually the pipit is more standardized, and I shouldn't have closed that tab. I should have gone back to horn lark, because next for horn lark I want to do the tier and the lower notes. This stuff. This one. And then we have to start to compare that to the low whistles that we get from snow bunting. Even lower. And then even more challenging is to throw in the similar low-pitched calls. More polyphonic on average. Not that I'd put it past them to make a clear note from time to time. And then to deal with the rattle calls, there is a good set of comparisons for this. There's a whole article for comparing the rattles of the longspur snow bunting and also brown-headed cowbird for good measure, that are all here. If you want to analyze spectrograms, this can be quite helpful. But when it comes to just listening to the rattle, there's a Lapland longspur rattle just for it's got a little bit of texture to it. There's one without as much buzz to the call. And then let's compare that with snow bunting. We have a 2. Got that clear drop. I feel like the snow bunting seems slightly less of a hard rattle than some of the Laplands, but I don't know. Never heard this. Anyway, that's that for those guys. Okay, let's dive in. Let's do the sparrow stuff. So one of the famous parts of the warblers is this group of species that are called the zeep warblers. Where's the species list here that we're going to talk with? The zeep complex. Here we're talking about worm-eating warbler, Louisiana water thrush, Connecticut warbler, cerulean warbler, magnolia warbler, bay-breasted warbler, Blackburnian warbler, yellow warbler, and blackpoll warbler. These all give very similar calls, quite hard to separate. Northern water thrush is similar, but different enough that I think it's not it's not considered as overlapping as these guys are with each other. This paper has some spectrographic analysis of the characteristics of these little bumpy things. They find things like, oh, maybe the worm-eating warblers average a little bit high-pitched, Blackburnian warblers, the bay-breasted warblers average a wider spacing between the bumps than the other species, but mostly they're so similar that it's very dubious to claim that they're separable most of the time, unless it's a couple of the standout ones like bay-breasted or some very very high-pitched worm eating is maybe separable. I haven't really put to use some of these other discrimination materials that they put in here. What do these zeeps sound like? Well, I put a few in here. Zeeps. Here are what a few different ones sound like. That's a pretty strong one. Guess I didn't put a lot of zeeps in here, did I? There's a zeep. Not super loud. Yeah, I didn't put too many zeeps in here. We can get some off of this page of the Evans and O'Brien group. So if we were to take, for example, cerulean warbler, nice strong zeep. I also think of black pole as being one of the real strong ones, and yellow warblers also nice and strong. Where is yes. So those are pretty standard zeep calls. You can sort of hear the oscillation up and down that's going on. There's Blackburnian. Let's do that one. It's a quick and high one. Should be some more that aren't that quick. That's a little longer. You'll see that this guide will give comments like, it's sweet and high pitched. My ears aren't super well tuned to pick out some of the fine features, but I do think people can learn if they practice. So the next group of warblers to discuss are the double up warblers, the Tennessee orange-crowned Nashville. This is sort of a quick little street. Generally, these double ups are not considered very easy to separate from each other, or maybe I should say are generally considered impossible to separate from each other. Maybe there's something to be gained from further analysis, but it's pretty tough to separate those guys. But that's a flight call that I do hear a lot during the day, both the zeeps and the double ups. So definitely, I think it's possible to discern the double ups from the zeeps. I'm not very good at telling the double ups from the single ups by ear. That's a yellow-rumped warbler. It's a rising call that's pretty low. You're probably already more familiar with the chips. The yellow-rumped warbler chip is given quite a lot during the day. Guess that is the Western version. Another of the single up group. Again, I can't really tell that apart from the double ups very well, but it's probably doable. Those are pretty tricky. I also have trouble handling the prairie warbler. I don't really lock my old brain on that very well. Small and short and quick. Well, I'll just go right on ahead to pine. So pines, sorry, I said pine, but I meant palm. Palm has this this call that's thick and it drops. And I don't know, I've been getting a lot of practice with palm and getting them right during the day more. Somehow that sticks out with me, especially when they drop really hard. Maybe we have some examples here that are really, really strong. Sometimes the sound drops really, really low at the end of the call. Sorry, I can't type here. But lately, that's been a very helpful call for me to know. Again, could I distinguish that reliably from prairie when it doesn't chip that hard down? I don't know. Here, this is when it's really getting very chippy. Those chips are challenging because like there's so many chips. I hear the black-throated green chip quite a lot here in Pennsylvania. It seems somewhat distinctive. Sometimes I think I'm guessing it just because I know the habitat and what's common. But other times I think I'm starting to learn this chip. There are lots of warblers that chip, so I'm not identifying things by chip that much. It seems like when birds are flying around, most of the time the chips are the yellow rumps in the palm. Whereas with black-throated green, it seems like when they're flying around, they're doing their double up street call. But I wouldn't say that's a guarantee. It's just a bit of a tendency there. So those are some of the main ones. Then we have the down warblers. So northern Parula. The folks at Cape May get quite a lot of practice listening to this Parula sound. This, it's almost like a real quick field sparrow. It doesn't sound quite the same, but the general idea of it falling down as it calls is shared to some extent. Pine doesn't decline as steeply, but sometimes it does decline more than that one. Yeah, that I can hear the decline a little easier. Anyway, sometimes in real life I can hear that it's a downward call, but I'm not identifying those just by that, especially once you throw in another species that can decline. But compared to field sparrow, these calls are quicker. With the field sparrows, downhill calls are quite a good bit longer, longer than these. The redstart is another one that you can get a lot of practice on at Cape May. It's got this sort of this waver to it that you can hear. You can hear it come back up. Sweet, sweet. That down and back up characteristics a little bit chipping sparrow-like, but not quite the same as chipping sparrow. Anyway, that's a learnable one, and certainly the counters at Cape May are very good at recognizing. I'm not so good at it, but sort of halfway there. And the morning warbler is one that doesn't really seem to fly around much in the day, so I won't stress on that. Same for ovenbird, hooded warbler. The common yellowthroat, this call, I have heard it during the day, but not much, so not the most useful. But yeah, the buzzy warblers are not as helpful. Canada warbler, this call I've certainly heard during the day. It's very noticeably different from other warblers. It's got that low thing going on. So buzzier than zeeps. Let's review zeeps again. This is just normal zeep. That tends to be a little shorter than indigo bunting. Indigo bunting tends to be longer. It's not always that long, but they tend to be fairly long. There's a shorter one. It's just such a nice, strong call. One more warbler that I'd like to compare that back to is chestnut-sided. That one has a buzzy quality and is kind of longer, but the modulations aren't as deep, which gives it a different sound quality. I'm not sure how to describe the difference in the sound quality. Sometimes they can rise, sometimes they can fall. But I have had times where chestnut-sideds were around enough for a couple days in a row that I got used to that and could start to recognize that call, but it's usually fleeting, and a few weeks later I've mostly forgotten. Let's go back and listen to indigo bunting again. You can hear the high part of it goes quite high, which contrasts quite a bit with blue grosbeak, which is a little deeper. So I think people who get practice down in the South get a nice amount of practice recognition. That's a lower sound. I have heard that flight call and was like, whoa, that was lower than I thought I would expect. But if you want to talk about lower, you're almost getting down to long spur zone. But it's, much faster than a long spur rattle, so it just sounds like one low-pitched note with vibrato to it. Even though, if you look at the spectrogram, maybe like a rattle that's just whatever's. Nice call that you can pick up here in our county. It's been more than 10 years since anybody's found a dick thistle sitting on the ground, but we get them flying over day and night quite regularly, those of us who've learned this call. So that's a good one. I've skipped sparrows, and I don't want to go over all the sparrows, but I just want to talk about a couple of the ones that certainly helped me. I've definitely practiced more and more over time the chipping sparrow. This call's pretty recognizable, and I get a lot of exposure to it a little better. And so that's something that, of course, if you see it, you can put together with their small body and long tail spizelliform call. I had been talking about the comparison to field sparrow. This is a longer downhill. So a nice tsew. And Savannah also goes downhill, but it's quicker and real high. Combined with habitat expectation, it can be reasonably possible to start picking these out by their sound. But when they're randomly flying by in morning flight, these quick calls can be tough to get the brain to focus on and remember. It's certainly not as easy for me as Savannah. Vesper sparrow is one that when I'm in a place where I know vespers are around, I can tell that the call has the rise to it. And sometimes I start to suspect the bird is a vesper just by hearing the rise. But it's a pretty challenging distinction for me, by ear alone to make that call. Again, in Central PA, I don't get quite that much experience unless I'm in a very certain place. Song fox have this classic seep call. People talk about possibly looking at the difference between song and fox, these seep calls, but frankly, anytime that I've looked at it and tried to find what are the characteristics that make one different from the other, I see what looks like overlapping variation to my eyes and ears. But anyway, certainly if I'm in habitat and time of year that's good for fox, and I hear those kind of seep calls, especially when I'm in a woodsier area where song sparrows aren't as common, I'm always at least digging to see if it turns out to be a fox. I do get a pretty good amount of recognition on this. The very high, thin buzz of swamp and Lincoln. And apparently young song sparrows can do something quite similar, but it's at least worth digging for a Melaspisa if you hear that. White-crowned also has a nice rise to it. That's sometimes fairly recognizable. I guess everybody knows the Junco rattle. There's a little bit of high-pitched notes, but not as much of a, these kind of chevron notes a lot of sparrows will make, but the sort of standard rattling cadence of a Junco is pretty unique to Junco. Anyway, those are the ones that I think people should know. I'll end with a playthrough of a bunch of nocturnal flight calls and comment on what they are. But I think what people really want is me to make a quiz, which I haven't done yet. I think this is a Cape May, upland. Collecting a lot of possible rosebreast grosbeaks. It's a really soft nocturnal song I couldn't figure out, so I threw it in. Just basic gross beaks. And lemons. Play a sparrow. Great sheep touch. Another rose by Grosbeak. Anyway, that's all for tonight.